So next up, we venture into a new territory to investigate this question. What is the role of medicine, entheogens, and psychedelics in the new mental health paradigm? In what ways can they become game changers in treating mental illness and transforming people's view of themselves in the world? We start with a panel of luminaries talking about the future of psychedelic medicine and psychotherapy. Please welcome back Dr. Deepak Chopra, and he's going to be in conversation with my dear friend, Dr. Geeta Vaid, a board-certified psychiatrist in New York who has had a transformative practice in ketamine-assisted psychotherapy. She's also the spokesperson for the Chopra Foundation for the public awareness for and education for psychedelic medicine. And J.R. Rahn, the founder and CEO of MindBed, a company which is developing psychedelic medicines and experiential therapies through FDA-assisted clinical trials. This week, I'm really proud to say this, the Chopra Foundation also announced a strategic partnership with MindMed for the public awareness, education, and research on psychedelic medicine and the future of mental health. Please welcome Dr. Deepak Chopra, J.R. Rahn, and Dr. Geeta Vaid. Hello.
Hi.
Hi.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here and so excited to participate in this conversation with you, JR, and Deepak, because with the knowledge both of you hold in your organizations and independently, I'm very excited because I'm recognizing the potential you have to change mental health and medicine, as well as consciousness evolution. So welcome, and I'm delighted to be here. Perhaps you could start, JR, by telling us a little bit about MindMed and your commitment to psychedelic medicine.
Sure. So MindMed was set up because I saw effectively what I believe to be a misallocation of capital by society and the capital markets to a substance that had a significant history from the 1960s and earlier, and wasn't being looked at as a medicine, was ultimately still regarded as a recreational drug. And MindMed was set up to develop and discover and ultimately deploy psychedelic medicines. And we just recently listed it on the NASDAQ, and Deepak was there, and we were able to look up at the tower in Times Square together. And I think in many ways, that was really an epiphany for me, that the world is now changing and mental health is becoming extremely important in our lives. And ultimately, we need to allocate capital to empower folks like you, Geeta, that do research and can ultimately make new paradigms to treat mental health and novel medicines.
Thank you. I'm very excited because psychedelic medicines really allow one to explore mindfulness practices, meditation, non-ordinary states, the nature of reality, wisdoms and knowledge that Deepak is an expert in and has been studying and talking and writing about for decades. I'm wondering what you make of all of this, Deepak. How do you feel psychedelic experience and psychotherapy can transform individual experience and their mental states?
So thank you, Geeta, and thank you, JR, for joining this panel. I've been interested, as you know, for all my life on what we call fundamental reality. What is the ontological primitive of the universe? Is it matter? Is it consciousness? And of course, I've also been engaged in what we call the future of well-being, both as well-being that is preventive, but also reversible, chronic disease reversible. And as I've looked at that data, it's very obvious that the future of well-being is precise, it's predictable, it's participatory, it's process-oriented, and it's also personalized, because no two people react in the same way to any intervention whatsoever. In that context, I've looked at, over the years, the use of psychedelics, particularly in mental distress. And I'm using the word mental distress more than anything else, because I think our diagnostic categories of mental illness, first of all, have stigma And secondly, they are not really useful. Mental distress covers everything from low-grade anxiety, low-grade depression to suicidal ideation and everything in between, including bipolar, schizophrenia, etc. It's a non-stigmatized term. And now that we're looking at psychedelics, which have also been stigmatized, we can see already the data that exists in PTSD, the data that exists in severe anxiety and low-grade anxiety, the data that exists in terminal people facing death. That data already exists. Now, there's new data that is suggesting that psychedelics may also decrease inflammation, which, as you know, is a common factor in almost every chronic disease, along with anxiety and depression. In fact, our meta-analysis shows that low-grade anxiety, low-grade depression, and low-grade inflammation precede chronic illness sometimes by decades. By decades. And of course, now that we have the ability to look at inflammatory markers, we can actually predict who's going to get sick in the future. Here comes the insight from psychedelics. If psychedelics decrease inflammation, if they also, as some data suggests, decrease the activity of the default mode network, which is the neurological correlate for what we call ego identity, which is always in fear, in anticipation, in need of validation, aggressive, highly critical. And if psychedelics decrease the activity of the default mode network, if they decrease inflammation, as the data suggests, and as the clinical evidence already suggests that they're useful in PTSD, which is, a huge problem in our veterans, and also in suicidal ideation and depression, then I think it behooves us to actually look at all the data that exists and make the public aware. First of all, to destigmatize mental distress. I'm using that word now because that is not a stigmatizable label, and destigmatize the use of psychedelics. As you know, Geeta, you and I have sat with patients who are terminal in the midst of the last stages of life and in fear, and we've sat with them through ketamine-assisted therapy and seen enormous peace and release, and a release of fear and comfort even in the last stages of life. So I think psychedelics need to be explored, research needs to be done, public needs to be aware of the data, of the need for destigmatizing what we call mental illness and the use of psychedelics. And so I'm very actually thrilled to be participating with you in the research and with JR, who's supporting this research as well. So we have a good team here.
Definitely. I'm really excited. What do you have plans? What studies and compounds are you looking at, JR?
We have a pretty wide focus in pipeline at the moment. Ultimately, we saw that there weren't many folks pursuing LSD. There was a lot of companies and organizations that were looking at psilocybin, but sort of the first really modern psychedelic, right, that came out of Switzerland, the Dr. Albert Hofmann, which actually came out of Sandoz Laboratories, which is now a part of Novartis. There wasn't really many groups pursuing that. So we were able to start a collaboration with the University of Hospital Basel in Basel, Switzerland, to pick up where they left off with over 10 years of research on LSD. We are also looking at other psychedelics with various research collaborations. We're looking at mescaline, which we just recently announced yesterday. We are also looking at DMT and MDMA. We've actually started the first ever MDMA and LSD, to our knowledge, clinical trial that's looking at, can these two substances be combined together and used for a better therapeutic effect? So that's going to be very, very interesting to look for. In terms of areas that we're covering, in substances, our project Lucy is focused on generalized anxiety disorder. We chose this particular indication after consulting the FDA, and we'll be headed into a phase 2B trial in Q4 most likely. And we are now just preparing the final submission of the IND there. There will be a 200 patient trial that will be multi-site in the United States. We also will soon be starting a microdosing trial called Project Flow. It's, I believe, the first ever commercial drug trial of microdosing of LSD, and we're looking at adult ADHD. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence, and that microdosing may have some form of an effect on focus. And while we look at current solutions to ADHD that are really amphetamine based, these are things that I was prescribed as a child. We ultimately thought maybe there is a better solution out there, and we should take a look. So this will be a proof of concept trial. It's with Dr. Kim Kupiers at Maastricht University will be helping us with that. In addition, we just recently announced an entry into the pain market as well with LSD. We don't have much to disclose yet exactly what pain indications we're focused on, but we ultimately see this opioid crisis that's ravaging America, and just recently was the topic of a HBO documentary. I don't know if you saw it. It's costing the country $500 billion a year. So that's another area of key focus for us. And we are not only looking at classic psychedelics, but we're also looking at novel forms of psychedelics or derivatives of psychedelics. So we have one other program, 18MC, which is a derivative of Ibogaine, looking at how can we treat opioid withdrawal and addiction.
It's so exciting to hear you talk about all of these extraordinary compounds, particularly since we know and have tons of data that they're incredibly safe compounds, even if they've been classified in different schedules. But what I'm interested in addition to the safety of these molecules, a lot of it has to do with the way in which someone learns to navigate these places. And I'm really impressed at the meditation potential, mindfulness potential. And I was thinking a lot about conditioned mind. And Deepak writes a lot about conditioning and the path to becoming meta-human. I'm wondering, Deepak, how you see these compounds which allow someone to break out of their karma or sankara. What is your thought about how it allows people to travel that course with minimal effort?
So every experience we have, it doesn't matter what the experience is, once we interpret it, then we have a conditioned mind, because you've now conditioned yourself to interpret experiences in a certain way. That happens with every experience, sensory experience, no matter what. So if you were a kid and you grew up eating spicy food, you're conditioned now to eat spicy food, and you may never enjoy chocolate ice cream, and vice versa. So with every sensory experience, there's a conditioning that occurs that actually, in a way, limits our freedom to enjoy experience, because we repeat the experience, and that's what we call habit. But habit also becomes what we call predictable responses to situations, circumstances, events, people. In other words, total lack of creativity. We become biological robots that are triggered by people and circumstance into predictable outcomes. In other words, we become algorithms. And this, in spiritual traditions, is called the conditioned mind, which interferes with liberation or freedom from conditioning, or freedom to create, freedom to love, freedom to be. And, this is one of the highest aspirations of spirituality, to find self-realization, finding yourself beyond your conditioned self. In other words, not sacrificing yourself for your selfie meaning your projection of who you are instead of who you are. So when I say I'm Deepak Chopra, already there's a history. That history is referred to as karma, but karma is nothing but conditioned mind, habits that recycle as the same indulgences. And some of these are, of course, extreme. We call them addictions. Now, what psychedelics do is they remove the editing and the editing process. Aldous Huxley spoke of, he was one of the first few people to experiment with psychedelics, Aldous Huxley, and one of the greatest writers of the century. And he said that our normal experience of reality is a reducing valve in that we take infinite possibilities that are right in front of us, but we reduce them to very limited reactions. So instead of responding restfully, instead of responding intuitively, instead of responding creatively, instead of responding with a new imagination, instead of responding inspired, instead of having a higher vision, instead of transcending the situation, basically we just react in the same old way, recycle old habits and recycle the problems that go with the habits. Pure consciousness, which is beyond the conditioned mind, is a field of infinite possibilities. It's a field of infinite correlation. It's a field of uncertainty. It's a field of creativity. And it's the source of our attention and intention. Just imagine if you had that capacity, infinite possibilities, synchronicity, comfort with uncertainty, access to creativity, and harnessing the power of attention and intention. Well, what would we call that? We would call that freedom. So I see a big role in the future in the expansion of consciousness from what I call the fight flight response and the reactive response into the restful awareness response, the intuitive response, the creative response, the visionary response, and ultimately the sacred response.
It's such a different, exciting picture, and it really shifts mental health from the way in which I've been trained to practice, which is diagnosing illness and treating them and trying to have symptom relief from psychic distress, to, as Deepak saying, really a growth, wellness, expansion, creative world. That's quite a different vision. It's very exciting. And how do you envision, what do you imagine the future of mental health will look like, JR, with your work and your vision? What will treatment look like for individuals?
Sure. I think, ultimately ending up wherever Deepak's mind is headed is going to be the best. But I think we're going to have to do that incrementally, right? This is, we still have the sometimes shackles of society and government that will dictate how we develop these substances, how we and ultimately how we enact change in the mental health care system, because the mental health care system is deeply broken, at least very much here in the United States, right? It's just if you look at it from a misallocation of capital, we spend $3.5 trillion a year on healthcare in the United States. That's 18% of GDP, yet we only spend less than 10% of that on behavioral health. That doesn't seem right, given that I think the average American and person considers their mental health as important as their physical health. But if we look at the future of what this ultimately holds, I think there's a day in the not too distant future where some of these psychedelics will be approved. We still need to go through that rigorous FDA clinical trial process to prove that they're safe and effective. But as we move forward, I think the seminal question that has to be answered for the space, Gita, is scalability of mental health care and these substances. We're not trying, MindMed and I hope other companies in our space, we're not trying to make a fee-for-service model, where that only puts clinics on Park Avenue and doesn't help people on Main Street. Like, that would be the biggest mistake possible that we could do with this renaissance in psychedelics right now. We need to make
really help the world. Yes.
Sorry?
Trying to help the world so
yes,
we can all benefit.
Yes. And the fact of the matter is that you are a very rare commodity. in here in this country and globally. There's not enough psychiatrists. Simply just are not enough. I think there's something like 38,000. And I'm not trying to commodify you, but it's a fact. There's very few of you, and we need to somehow figure out how to make you more scalable. And I think ultimately, what will make psychedelics scalable and also provide accessibility to communities that are disenfranchised is going to be technology. We can't put a psychiatrist in every city. We know that, right? 60% of US counties don't have a psychiatrist. 80% of rural counties don't have a psychiatrist. But if we can enable technology to connect psychiatrists and those that want to be part of this renaissance in mental health, there's no reason that an EMT could not be trained in psychedelic assisted therapy as a therapist and work with psychiatrists that are remote to ultimately create some form of a better mental health care. And as much as this is going to be about psychedelics, they're not panaceas, right? They're catalysts for change. They're catalysts for change in our mental health. But the integration therapy and the time afterwards was so important in my journey that I know, and many really do profess this, that integration is the key moment.
Absolutely. I think you're absolutely right. And this is, I think, where meditation and other practices and tools can be so valuable to assist. Thank you so much for participating. It's been a pleasure to see you both and see what you're creating for the future. Thank you.